Hollywood takes care of its own. I know, because my name's Crosby, and heaven knows it's taken care of me. But if it wasn't for the Motion Picture Relief Fund, a lot of performers less fortunate than myself would be in trouble. The money that you popped for this platter goes to the Relief Fund. And by way of thanking you, here, in alphabetical order, are some favorites of yours with some favorites of theirs. First, a ravishing redhead, who's amused and entertained you on the screen and on television, Miss Lucille Ball.
Thank you, Bingo. During the war, I was lucky enough to travel with a USO show entertaining some troops, and I heard a great story about a magician. It seems that this magician was doing a show on a ship, and he worked with this fantastic talking parrot. Now, it was near the end of his act. He was doing his big trick, and the parrot was perched on a stool, and the magician unfolded a large, beautiful silk scarf and held it right in front of the parrot. Now, just at this moment, the ship was torpedoed. A few minutes later, as fate would have it, the magician and the parrot were both clinging to the same log. The parrot turned to the magician and said, "All right, smart guy, what'd you do with the boat?" "I have a true one. As a gift on my mother's birthday, I sent her a beautiful talking bird. The next day I called her and said, 'Mom, did you like the bird?' She said it was delicious. I said, 'Mom, you ate it? That was a very expensive bird. That bird spoke 5 languages. Mom said, 'Well, if it was so smart, why didn't it say something before I put it in the oven?'" Oh, but one of my favorite stories is about this man who'd worked for 15 years in the circus, and his job was to follow the elephants with a pail and a shovel. 15 years he followed the elephants. And one day he was complaining to a friend of his, and he said, I don't know what I'm going to do. For 15 years in this circus, all I've ever been allowed to do is follow the elephants with a pail and a shovel." And his friend said, "Why don't you quit?" And he said, "What, and give up show business?"
As Lucille lopes off with an arch look over her lovely shoulder, the jocose gent from Waukegan, Illinois saunters on, characteristically wringing his hands and with a gleam in his eye which guarantees that you're about to be regaled with one of his choice stories. Jack Benny.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Jack Benny talking, and now I'd like to tell you my favorite story. This story has to do with 2 fellas discussing the parallel of words. That is, words that are pronounced alike or spelled differently, or words entirely different one from the other, and yet they have the same meaning. And this 2 men were discussing this right here in Los Angeles, and one said to the other, he says, take the words irritation and aggravation. Now, they're supposed to mean the same thing, but they really do not. The fellow said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, now I'll show you. I'll give you an example of exactly what I mean. The words irritation and aggravation. Now, hand me that telephone directory there. Now, I'll pick any name and any number at random, and I'll call up. Now, first, I'll show you what irritation is." Well, anyway, this fella picks a number, any number, in the phone book, Crestview 00097, right? And the phone rings. The lady says, "Hello?" And he says, "Hello." He says, "I'd like to speak to Herman, please." The lady says, "Well, I'm sorry, there's no Herman living here." She says, "You must have the wrong number." Oh, he says, "Well, I'm terribly sorry." And he hung up. Now, a minute later, he called the same number, dialed the exact same number. Now, the phone rang. Same lady answered the phone, and she said, "Hello." He said, "Hello, I'd like to speak to Herman, please." And the lady said, "Now, you must be the gentleman that called before, and as I told you, there is no Herman living here. I'm sorry." So he says, "Well, so am I, and thank you," and he hung up. Another minute goes by, and he dialed the same number. The same lady answered the phone. She said, "Hello." He said, "I'd like to speak to Herman, please." And she says, "Now, wait a minute." Now, this time she's angry. She says, "Wait a minute. You're the same guy. I've told you 3 times. There's no Herman living here. Now check with information and find out where he is and leave me alone. And she hung up. So this fellow turned to his friend. He says, now that's irritation. Now I'll show you what aggravation is. He dialed the same number. The same lady answered the phone and said, hello? He said, hello, this is Herman. Were there any messages for me? Well, thank you very much, and good luck to the fund.
Now, here's a fellow with a dolorous kind of a kisser, but actually it belies what lies beneath, because his dry, delightful humor really crackles and pops. You know him, you love him, Joy Bishop.
I want to thank you, Bing Crosby, for letting me play through. And I want to tell you how flattered I am that the Motion Picture Relief Fund asked me would I do one of my favorite stories. And while I'm at it, I would want to thank Danny Thomas, who took me out of motion pictures, and I did a few of them. I did one called The Naked and the Dead. I played both parts. And we did one with Frank Sinatra entitled Ocean's 11, a story of 11 men who robbed 5 hotels in Las Vegas. And when Sinatra read the script, he said, the heck with the picture. Let's go through with the robbery. I also want to say that I am now involved in television, thanks to Danny Thomas. He came to me a few years ago. He said, get on television, you'll clean up. I followed Wagon Train. And what I do want to say is that one of my favorite little stories involves one of our great comedians, Joey Lewis. It seems that Joey Lewis and I decided to play gin rummy in my room. This was in Las Vegas, and as luck would have it, just as I took the cards out of the deck and started to shuffle them, all the lights went out in the city of Las Vegas, and they were out for 48 minutes. And when the lights finally did come back on again, I said, gin. And without batting an eyelash, Joey Lewis says, I never cut the cards. Then, of course, my other favorite story involves my very dear friend, Buddy Hackett, who thinks he's my doctor. It seems that Buddy and I were enjoying the luxury of just sitting around our homes in Englewood, New Jersey, and our wives decided we had it too good, and they decided we should do the shopping. So they sent Buddy Hackett and I out to just buy anything at all, just get out of the house and go shopping. Buddy Hackett and I returned with 2 Jaguars. I don't mean the animals, I mean the sports cars. Which gets me further involved in the fact that Buddy Hackett was told by the gentleman who sold us the cars, never let anyone else but yourself park it. When Buddy was working in Philadelphia, and he wanted to park the car, and the attendant said, I'm sorry, sir, I will have to park it for you. So the fella took the car, and he ran it right through a wall. And when I saw Buddy Hackett a few weeks later, he told me he was suing the parking lot because he had a back injury. And I said to him, Buddy, I can't understand it. You tell me the fella took the car and parked it for you, and yet you have a back injury. He says, that's right. When I saw him going at 35 miles an hour into the wall, I went, ugh! And that's how I injured my back.
Coming up in the next slot is, I guess, one of the most amusing men in the world. And I mean off stage or on. He's a wit's wit, a comedian's comedian, a cigar maker's windfall. Here's the Paul Anka of the Boxer Rebellion, George Burns, Old Sugarthroat.
Thank you, Gary's father, who happens to be a very dear friend of Dolores Hope's husband. Now, I just came from the Hillcrest Country Club, and this might be interesting news. Years ago, when Georgie Jessel did The Jazz Singer, and the Warner Brothers signed Jolson to play in the picture, Jessel got very mad, and he took an oath. He said that if it takes him all his life, he's going to break the Warner Brothers. And it looks like the Warner Brothers should be broke next week because Jessel is down to his last $360. In fact, if Jessel meets a girl tonight, the Warner Brothers will be broke tomorrow. And I must tell you a story about the Jazz Singer. Before Jessel would play the Jazz Singer, they'd have a beauty contest in each town, and the 5 prettiest girls would play a week in the Jazz Singer. So naturally, Jessel had a ball. He'd interview these girls. They'd sit on a couch. He'd put his arms around them. He'd talk to them. And he had Milford working for him, and Jessel was married at the time. And Milford's job was that when there was a knock on the door, Milford would jump on the couch and Jessel would answer the door. Because every time his wife caught him kissing a girl, she'd hit him over the head with a vase. And that gave him headaches. You know, when you hit 6, 7 times a week, you get nervous. Anyway, sitting on the couch with this beautiful girl, and there was a knock on the door, and Milford jumped on the couch, and Jessel went to answer the door. When Jessel came back, he says, "What a relief." He says, "It was the bellboy. I thought it was my wife." And his wife says, "How could it be me? I'm sitting on the couch here with Milford." You know, I'm a very dear friend of Jessel's, and he's a great artist and a great performer, and I shouldn't tell stories like that about him. And I'm going to tell you a nice, clean story about Jessel. Let's see. This isn't going to be easy. Oh yeah, he was playing in Cleveland, and there was a girl in town. She was giving lectures on psychology, and no, I can't tell this to a mixed audience. But if you gentlemen leave the room, I'll be glad to tell it to you ladies. This might be cute. When Jessel played the Orpheum circuit, he was playing in Winnipeg, and there was an act on the bill in Winnipeg called Croveny and Brown, acrobatic dancers, and this Croveny was the most beautiful girl you've ever seen, and in Winnipeg it gets very cold, and Jessel, and he played Vancouver. In Vancouver, there was Lasky's Redheads on the bill, and there was this tall redheaded girl. And in Seattle, right next door to the theater, there was this restaurant, and there was this blonde cashier who wanted to go into show business. And in Portland, Fresno, Sacramento, it's just crazy. There must be something I could say about Jessel. Let's see, let's go back to his childhood. When Jessel was 7 years old, I didn't go back far enough. Well, let's look into the future. When Jessel is 80 years old, he certainly won't, he certainly will. If I know Jessel, he will. Hasn't stopped Marie Chevalier, it won't stop Jessel. Well, I've got to go back to the Hillcrest Country Club. Goodbye, everybody.
You know, I could elaborate expansively and with some acerbity about this next chap, but after all, this is a family record. Ladies and gentlemen, my good friend and his, Bob Hope.
Thank you very much, Dad. It's nice to be here with the grand old man of song, the Stone Age Fabian. We've worked together many, many times. In fact, I met Bing when I first came to Hollywood. Of course, everybody met Bing because he was the first one out here. He was a used buffalo dealer originally. But I would like to tell a story that I've told many, many times, and I think it'd be very interesting. It's a show business story because when I was on the Orpheum time in 1930, I was very young, full of energy, not much talent, but a lot of energy, and ready to go, a lot of enthusiasm. And I was doing very well for the Orpheum people, and but all the other acts in the bill used to say, "Wait till you play St. Louis at the St. Louis Theater. It's a big barn, and it's a graveyard for comedians. All the comedians die there." And I couldn't wait to get to this place because it was a challenge, and I was ready for it. And I rehearsed real good, and finally the first show arrived. I walked on stage determined to grab this audience, and for the first 4 or 5 minutes, I was very happy. They were laughing and laughing good. Then an expectant mother in the first row decided to top my delivery. And everybody looked that way. There were little squeals. The ushers came down. A doctor came down. They carried this woman out, and they finally looked back at me on the stage, and the boat had sailed. And I said, I don't know what to do to top that, play my finish music. And I went into my finish number, walked off, took a fast bow, turned to the manager in the wings and said, well, how about that? And he said, well, at least she brought something new to the theater. That's showbiz, ladies and gentlemen.
I really don't think you should play this next groove until after you've had dessert, because you're about to be regaled by the world's foremost after-dinner speaker. Tell you something, he can bend your ear pretty good during dinner, too. The Toastmaster General of the United States, the sometimes Honorable George Jessel.
This is Georgie Jessel speaking, named by 2 or 3 presidents, if you'll allow me, as the Toastmaster General of the United States. And perforce of this business of making speeches, I've naturally told a great many stories throughout the years. And I've found that when you make fun or get a laugh at the expense of an important person, a real important person, he or she never mind it. It's only somebody who isn't so big who will take an exception. So this is a profound story, I think. And it is a story that is told that the Lord God came down on earth many, many, many years ago, and he came to Persia. And he chose a Persian from a group of men and called him out and said, I have come to bring thee a commandment. And the Persian said, how much is it? And the Lord said, nothing. And the Persian said, what is the commandment? And the Lord said, the commandment is, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor, etc., etc., etc. And the Persian said, well, I don't want that commandment. We get along fine without that. And never mind, and walked away. And the Lord went further and finally came into Egypt. And there he chose an Egyptian and said, I've come to bring thee a commandment. And the Egyptian says, how much is it? And the Lord said, nothing at all. What is the commandment? Said the Egyptian. And the Lord said, thou shalt not steal. And the Egyptian said, now look, that's what we do here, and we're getting along fine. We don't need this commandment. So the Lord wandered away. And he suddenly came upon a tribe wandering in the wilderness. And he chose a man to speak to, and the man was Moses. And he said, I've come to bring thee a commandment. And Moses said, how much is it? And the Lord said, nothing. Moses says, I'll take 10. That's one of the biggest yokes I've ever had, and I'm so happy to have entered in here in such a good cause. This is Georgie Jessel saying thank you.
Some years ago, a pair of flashing feet flew out of Pittsburgh to the Broadway stage, and then flipped to Hollywood, where the camera discovered that their owner not only danced like a demon, he could also act up a storm and sing like a swan. Well, all right then, a canary. Here is dancer, actor, singer, director, producer, choreographer, choir boy, Gene Kelly.
Thank you, Bing. It's a pleasure indeed to have you bring me on. And thanks, too, for having originated Father O'Malley. For without you, I never would have had my crack at it. Which brings me to the point of my story. It seems that when I followed Bing in the part of Father O'Malley, everybody and his brother wanted to tell me his favorite joke about a priest. Well, here's the one I like the best. It happened at a local youth organization. They had a card of boxing bouts arranged for the young fighters of the neighborhood, and one of the onlookers, who was sitting next to a priest, saw one of the boys just before the fight began kneel down on one knee and bless himself, make the sign of the cross. He turned to the priest and said, Father, that boy there, he just blessed himself. Will that help him? The priest replied, not if he can't fight. And so, back to Bing.
I suppose there are a lot of synonyms for cheerfulness. Vivacity, joviality, geniality, conviviality, quick wit, but the two words that are most synonymous with all of them and more are simply Art Linkletter.
Here on House Party, as you know, we have most fun with the kids because the best unrehearsed interviews in the world are children under 10 years of age and women over 70. You know why? They're the only ones left who'll tell you the absolute truth. The women over 70 don't care what they're saying, and the kids under 10 don't know what they're saying. And especially my favorite stories come from children who are brought here from various church schools. They give us their version of the Bible. And I remember one little 7-year-old boy who was bouncing up and down with the excitement of the story about David and Goliath. He said David went down to the brook and he got a pebble and he put it in his slingshot and he whirled it around his head 5 times and then he hit the big old giant Goliath right in the middle of the forehead, and this big old bully fell right over dead. And I said, well, that's pretty good. You certainly know the story of the Bible. But I said, do you know what that story teaches us? Because all Bible stories teach us something. The little boy thought a minute. He says, duck. Of course, I guess my favorite story comes from the lips of a beautiful little blue-eyed, blonde-haired, 4-year-old girl who came to us from a Catholic school recently. So I said to this little girl, what is your favorite Bible story, honey? She says, I like the story of Edom and Av. I said, Edom and Av? Who were they? And she said, they were 2 bear people who lived in a big public park. And I said, what'd they do there? She says, oh, you know, they raked up the leaves and they kept the swimming pool clean. And I said, well, then what happened? She says, oh, they did something very bad. They kept eating the cherries off the bush. And I said, well, they shouldn't have done that. She says, they certainly shouldn't. And God was very mad at them. And he was going to punish them, but they hided. And he found them, and he punished them terrible. I said, well, what did he do? Well, she says, the first thing he did, he sent them both down to hell. I said, oh, isn't that awful? She says, but she did something worse. I said, what's that? She says, he turned them into Protestants. That's the kind of story that is very popular during this administration. Incidentally, here is another new way to look at Adam's fall from grace as seen through the eyes of a cautious 7-year-old boy. I asked him, what does the story of Adam and Eve teach you? And he said, if a naughty girl tempts you to do something bad, don't do it while God is watching. Incidentally, heaven sounded so good to one boy, he told me he decided to become a preacher. I said, what kind? He says, a Baptist. I said, why a Baptist? He says, because I want to make sure I get into heaven. And I said, what makes you so sure that Baptists get into heaven? And he said, St. Peter is one, and he's right there at the gate. Kids say the darndest things.
Here's an outrageous wit. Iconoclastic deflator of the snobbish and pompous, and a wily opponent in any contest of ad-lib thrust and riposte, that master of them all who has shredded audiences from behind cameras and in living rooms too, a dear and lovely man with a heart of pure marshmallow and a tongue of sulfuric acid, Groucho Marx.
This is Groucho Marx coming to you from his living room in the Truesdale Estates, where the rent is ridiculous and the price of a house is out of all reason. At any rate, what I want to talk about is golf. I'm not a well-known golfer like Palmer or Hagen or Hogan or any of the good golfers. As a matter of fact, I was playing on the Orpheum circuit in San Francisco, and there was a chap on the bill named Frank Crumit, who was a monologist and a singer and an excellent golfer. He shot around 74, 76, and he was crazy about the game, and I didn't know anything about golf. I'd never played golf. Oh, I'd been out 2 or 3 times, but I had no knowledge and no idea of how to play. So he invited me out to play that afternoon. This was after the matinee. I says, where are we going to play? Have you entree to any country club or golf club? He says, no, we'll go out to Lincoln Park in San Francisco. There's a municipal links there, and it's a pretty nice course, and we'll have a lot of fun. So I rented some sticks out there, and we teed off there. And I hit the ball about 150 yards off the tee. Wasn't always straight down the fairway, but at least I hit it. And it was fairly presentable, and he didn't seem particularly surprised that I didn't play well. He was booming it down the fairway, 230 yards, and making chip shots that would do credit to Ben Hogan. Well, we finally got to the 7th tee. Now, I have to describe this tee. The tee is high up on a hill, and down below about, I would say 100 feet below, is the green. Now this is a short 3-par, and I think it was about 150 yards. Well, I started to use a driver, and Frank says, don't use a driver, Groucho. This is a short shot. Get out an iron. Well, I said, well, I don't know. Which iron should I use? He says, well, take a 4-iron. So I took out a 4-iron, and I took a good, healthy swing. And the ball went right on the green and kept rolling and went right into the cup. Well, Frank Crumit, who was with me, he jumped 18 feet in the air. He says, Groucho, do you know what you've done? You just made a hole in one. I says, why, is that difficult? I says, haven't you ever done that? He says, I've been playing 20 years. I've never done that. I said, well, it doesn't seem like much of a trick. I could do that again, I think. Well, anyway, we finished the 18 holes, and we got back, and somehow it leaked out. I think Frank Crumit gave it to the newspapers, because the next morning, in both the Examiner and in the San Francisco Chronicle, they had me on the sporting page, and on one side of me they had Bobby Jones, and then on the other side they had a picture of Walter Hagen, who were the two great reigning champs at that time. And underneath it said, Groucho Marx joins the Immortals. Well, they kept phoning me from the two papers and asked me if I was going to play again the next day. I said, yes, I'll go. I kind of like this game. Looks pretty easy. So each of the newspapers sent a reporter out with a photographer. And we got to the same hole, and I teed off with the same iron I used the time before, and I went into a sand trap on the side of the green. Well, I went in there with some kind of a club that Crum had instructed me to use, and I hit it over the green into the other sand trap. And I kept on doing this until I finally got it on the green. By this time, I had taken 18 shots, and I finally sunk it on the 18th shot. And the next morning, the paper come out again, and they had a picture of Walter Hagen, and they had a picture of Bobby Jones. But the inside in the center where my picture had been the day before was now gone. And I remember in the San Francisco Chronicle it said, Groucho Marx leaves the Immortals. Well, that was the finish of golf for me. I didn't play again for 20 years.
When this next fella blinks behind the ocular windshields that are his trademark and hisses, I'm glad to see you, he really is as glad to see you as you always are to see him, Phil Silvers.
Hi, this is Phil Silvers, a strange type comedian. I guess I'm the one comedian that doesn't know any stories. My humor leans more to anecdotes, and this one concerns one of my favorite people in show business, who's been a friend of mine for many, many years, Eddie Foy Jr. Those of you who may not remember the great Eddie Foy, not only was he a great comedian, but can you imagine the great thrill in show business when he appeared in vaudeville with his 7 children? And the act was called Eddie Foy and his 7 Little Foys, and they rang right down the ladder from Bryony Foy to Irving Foy. Bryony, of course, the famous producer, Charlie Foy, well-known horse bettor, and Eddie Foy Jr., who was and still is a great comedian. Well, Eddie had been in the act for many years with his dad, and they were very severely disciplined. Mr. and Mrs. Foy, the elder, lived in hotel suites, as was due them, as he being a great star, but the children, among them Eddie Jr., of course, lived in rooming houses. He never knew any other type of outside living when he was away from his home in New Rochelle other than rooming houses. Well, unfortunately, as the years went on, Mr. Foy the elder passed away, and to perpetuate the talent of the family, there was an act formed called Charlie Foy and the 5 Foys, one of them being Eddie Foy Jr., still living in rooming houses. One day that inevitable wire came from an agent in New York saying to Eddie Foy Jr., have placed you in new Ziegfeld show. Come into town immediately. Well, that was like hearing from heaven. Ziegfeld was, of course, a theatrical god. Eddie went with the wire to his brother Charlie and said, what do I do about this? Charlie says, what do? You go to New York. This is your big opportunity. And Eddie said, what about the act? He said, well, I'm not only your boss, I'm also your brother, and I cannot deny you this great opportunity. Well, Eddie went to New York, very nervous. He was to meet Ziegfeld, and that came off well, and Ziegfeld remembered his father, and suddenly Eddie turned around, who had been living on an allowance all his years in show business, to find that he was getting $750 a week. Well, this thrilled him no end, and he wanted to live up to that type of money, so the show that he was in was called Sonny, with the late and great Jack Donahue and Marilyn Miller. Well, they rehearsed about 3 or 4 weeks, and then the stage manager, as he inevitably does, came around to the company and said, where will you stay in Boston, Mr. Foy, where we break in the show? And Eddie thought of that $750 a week, and he said, well, where is Jack Donahue and Marilyn Miller going to live? And the stage manager informed him the Copley Plaza, the lush hotel of that day. And Eddie says, I'll be at the Copley Plaza, room with bath. Well, the stage manager gave him a queer look and made him his reservation. This was on a Friday. Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and then Monday night the show was to open. And so for moral support, I went up to see Eddie with his brother Charlie to give him good luck and stay with him before the opening night. We went up to his room at the Copley Plaza, which was a kind of a pleasant, small little room, little day bed, nice little shaving kit and things, all placed properly. And Eddie looked at us and says, if you think I'm nervous, forget it. He said, how can you miss in these kind of things? You rehearse properly, it's lush, it's going to be great, forget it, I'm not nervous. Charlie said, well, that's the way to be, kid, you'll be great. This is a small room, isn't it? Charlie said to Eddie. And Eddie said, well, you know, these big hotels, they give you little rooms because it's very classy, it's very compact. Charlie says, well, what are you paying here? He says, $10 a day. He says, $10 a day for this cubbyhole? And Eddie said, look, do you want to make me nervous? You're doing it. I'm very happy. It's a very nice room, and it's worth the $10. So Charlie says, okay. Well, I hang my coat. I'd like to shave, too, before the opening night. And Eddie said, well, I guess that's the closet over there. Charlie opened the door into the most beautiful suite you've ever seen. Eddie's been living in his hallway now for 4 days. He never thought of opening another door.
Every nation is justifiably proud of its master clowns. And we Americans can boast that among the international favorites looms a beaming redhead from Indiana. And we call him our own. Fracturingly funny with that touch, just that touch of pathos that marks the master. He is the indestructibly exulting Red Skelton.
Instead of telling you one of my favorite stories, I'd like you to hear one of my favorite routines during my performance here at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas. Thank you. Thank you. You're a lot of fun. You're a lot of fun. You really are. In my next little pantomime, I'm going to take you to a hospital. Oh, hey. I was in a hospital about a year ago. I had a little operation. Nothing trivial. 7 doctors removed my wallet. Hey, you want to know something? I reached one decision. You hang around a hospital long enough, they'll drive you nuts. You know that? With me, it's not a drive, it's a short putt to begin with. Hey, talking about putting, I played golf today. I shot a 72. Gonna play another hole tomorrow. Hey, I'm trying to get my wife interested in golf. And she says, I can't carry them heavy clubs. I said, well, get a caddy. She did. 1963 convertible. Hey, but the nurses in the hospital, they mean well, bless their little hearts, but they drive you nuts. Wake up, wake up, wake up. Time for your sleeping pill. Hey, you should have seen some of the nurses I had. I had one who came in, she looked, I never saw such a crowd of people in one person in all my life. She had a little medal that said, Angel of Mercy. I thought to myself, boy, if this angel had wings, she looked like a Boeing 707. And my morning nurse, the routine she had. Well, how are we today? Did we have a good night's sleep? Did we have... Did we have our breakfast? Shall we have our bath? Oh, we almost fainted on that one, boy. Hey, the way they give you a bath in the hospital, isn't that horrible, huh? This nurse gave me a bath in bed, the idiot, and I fell out of the pan. Hey, one night I got real cold during the night. See, I get up and I put on a big Angora sweater. And then I put on one of those little surgical gowns, you know, that tie in the back. They ain't made for tall people, boy. Anyhow, I put on this big Angora sweater and this little gown. Now I get back into bed and I go to sleep. Now when I wake up, they're preparing me for surgery and this idiot shaving my sweater. Hey, and this old doc, I wasn't too sure about him either, you know. He'd come in, he'd say, oh, it's 3 o'clock, I wonder what time it is. He'd take his stethoscope, he'd say, now cough, now cough again, now cough again, now cough real hard, right? Tell me, how long you had this cough? But this old doc saved my life, boy. I had an asthmatic attack one night. We sent for him, and he didn't come. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. You're very kind. I do hope that you had as much fun as I had. It's really a lot of fun to try and make people laugh, because regardless of what your heartache might have been, while laughing for a few seconds, you've forgotten about it. I personally believe that each and every one of us was put here for a purpose, and that's to build and not to destroy. And if by chance someday you're not feeling well, you should remember some silly little thing that I've said or done, and it brings back a smile to your face or a chuckle to your heart, then my purpose as your clown has been fulfilled. Several times people have asked me, why do you finish your programs the way you do? Well, down deep, I actually feel, wouldn't it be a sad thing if one day went by that a friend didn't say God bless? Good night and thank you.
I guess only his closest friends know that, despite his inimitable talents as a dramatic actor, a nimble farceur, and a pilot of jet aircraft, Jimmy Stewart has a secret vice. He's a poet. For us, friend James gives us his first public recital, duly annotated.
Thank you, Bing. Well, you know, all of us poets need inspiration. And my delicate verse was inspired by a vacation trip my wife Gloria and I took. Like most families, we quarreled about vacation in the beautiful Rocky Mountains versus the seashore of the blue Pacific. And so, like most families, we compromised and went to Africa on safari. And at one point on the safari, I was after that elusive trophy, the leopard. And as all you leopard hunters know, your white hunters takes you into the bush where you erect a blind and then hang a large piece of bait from a nearby tree and settle down to wait for the leopard. And our white hunter, a fellow named Bunny Ray, he assured me that the leopard would be along pretty soon. And as we peered through the blind for a sign of a spotted cat, another cat, a female lion, quite fully grown, just sneaked up behind us and stood uncomfortably close. Uncomfortably, it was 6 feet away, to be exact. And she just sized us up. Well, Bunny Ray whispered for me to remain absolutely still, the most unnecessary instructions I've ever received. And as I sat there, holding my breath and slowly turning blue, Bunny raised one finger and wiggled it at the lioness. Well, she stared at the finger, and then ever so slowly he wiggled his other fingers and gradually moving his wrist back and forth like a tiny semaphore. And the lioness watched, her eyes moving with the wrist, and then he slowly waved his hand at her. And the lioness must have figured he was too crazy to make a good meal, so she turned and ambled off into the jungle, leaving me to exhale and turn chicken and fly back to California. Well, here now is my lyrical account of this incident. There's a lion in the blind, Bunny Ray, Bunny Ray. It just sneaked right in behind us and it will not go away. It happened while we watched a tree from which a bait did swing, a bait we hoped before the dark a leopard sure would bring. But up to now, the cat with spots has merely stayed away. And in its place, we've got a lion in the blind, Bunny Ray. Its tail kept moving to and fro. Its upper lip did curl. And also, to make matters worse, this lion was a girl. And so the three of us just stared at one another for, let's say, a minute or an hour, or perhaps it was all day. We moved our guns and pointed them between her amber eyes. It didn't seem to bother her, which came as no surprise. And then a strange thing happened as the sun began to set. It's really hard to figure, and I can't believe it yet. She sized us up with one long look, unfriendly, I would say, then blinked her eyes and arched her back and slowly walked away. Now, I'll do a lot of talking about this trip in years to come, the wonderful experience, the excitement, and the fun, but I suppose the tale I'll tell the most from day to day is when we had the lion in the blind, Bunny Ray. Well, that's it, friends. And now you know why I'm called the James Whittlers Riley of Hollywood.
Now, the comedian you're about to attend is also a philosopher. Or perhaps I should say the philosopher you're about to attend is a comedian. He's also an actor, a singer of songs, and a businessman of parts. In other words, a man of rare gifts. I know, I never got one from him, except this anecdote. Danny Thomas.
Thanks a lot, Bing, but I think you got my introduction confused with Jack Benny's. But thanks anyway for calling me a philosopher, because I do have a philosophy, and it's that good humor is ageless. And I hope I can prove it to you with a couple of stories that go back in my memory as far as my memory goes. I was just a kid selling soda pop in the gallery of a burlesque theater, and I heard a man named Abe Reynolds, who to me was one of the funniest comics that ever walked. And he did such great Yiddish stories. And one of them was Mrs. Lefkowitz walked into a delicatessen, and she said to the fellow back of the counter, "I would like to have some lox." For those of you who are non-cosmopolites, lox is salmon with high blood pressure. And he said, "How much lox would you like, Mrs. Lefkowitz?" She said, "Go ahead, cut. So he cut a few slices, and he said, "That'll make a nice lunch for you and your husband." She said, cut. So he cut a few more slices, and he said, "Maybe it's company you're having for dinner." She said, cut. So he cut a few more slices, and then he stopped and he said, "Mrs. Lefkowitz, you want all that lox?" She said, "Nah, the next 2 slices." And his other great story was on food, too. A fellow walked into a restaurant and ordered lobster. And they brought it to him, and it turned out the lobster was short 1 claw. So he called the captain of the waiters, and he said, "What's the matter? It's got only 1 hand, that lobster. What's cooking?" The captain said, "Please, sir, you're disturbing the guests." And the old man said, "Yes, schmiss, I'm paying, ain't it? How come it's got only 1 hand, that lobster?" So the captain said, "Well, sir, you see, that lobster had a fight with another lobster and lost a claw, that's all." And the old man said, "That's fine. Me, you couldn't give the winner."
Well, there you have it. Some conspicuous firsts by some dear people who want to help the Motion Picture Relief Fund. And you've helped, too, by buying this record, and we're all very grateful.